shouldn't be here. Go back.
I'd been hiking alone for hours, the kind of solitary trek I'd done many times before, thinking the isolation would be a kind of therapy. The Blue Ridge Trail was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of birds. It was late afternoon. The sunlight dappled through the tall pines, casting long, wavering shadows across the dirt path. I liked the sound of my own steps in the silence, the rhythm calming. But then I noticed it, the faintest hint of a whisper threading through the wind. At first, I brushed it off. Pines whisper in the wind all the time, don't they? But these voices didn't sound like wind. They were low, breathy, almost deliberate. I stopped mid-step, and so did the whispers. My pulse picked up. When I started walking again, they returned, curling around my ears and climbing my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just the forest, just the way the branches moved, but the rhythm was wrong, too human, too purposeful. The trail twisted along a gentle incline, the familiar rocks and roots I knew like old friends now appearing unfamiliar. The sun was falling faster than I thought, the sky streaking with muted oranges and purples, and with each step, the forest felt heavier. I realized I hadn't seen another hiker all day. Not a single soul. The sense of isolation wasn't new, but today it pressed differently, almost tangible, as if the woods themselves were aware of my presence. I forced myself to breathe steadily and focused on the trail ahead. That's when I noticed the clearing, subtle but unmistakable, tucked just beyond a curve. And then I saw the footprints. They were large, maybe too large to belong to any normal hiker. Oddly spaced, deep in the soil, they led off the main trail and disappeared into the denser thicket beyond the clearing. I froze. My rational mind screamed to turn back, yet something, a mix of curiosity and foolish pride, urged me to follow. Each step into the brush felt like crossing a threshold I hadn't intended to. The shadows deepened, twisting in ways that didn't align with the fading light. That's when I felt it, a pressure at the base of my neck, subtle at first, like the ghost of a hand resting there. My shoulders stiffened. I didn't dare turn around. My heart hammered in my chest, but I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks under the stress of isolation. The whispers grew louder, closer. Not quite forming words, but taunting, in a rhythm that matched my own breath. I could feel them circling, dancing along the edges of the trees. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to constrict, bending paths and shadows alike. Every tree looked like a sentry, every rock a face frozen in observation. The trail I had relied on became unreliable, landmarks shifting subtly when I tried to retrace my steps. Panic began to churn in my stomach, but I kept moving, forced forward by a mixture of fear and stubbornness. At one point, I stumbled over a root, hitting the ground hard enough to shake my confidence. When I looked up, the forest ahead seemed unfamiliar. The familiar curves of the trail had become a maze, paths leading into thickets I didn't recognize. The whispers had fallen into a pattern now, circling around me in a rhythm that felt like heartbeat. I began speaking aloud, calling out that I was alone, that I meant no harm, though no one answered. The act itself was absurd, but it anchored me, a fragile tether to reality. Time slipped in ways I couldn't measure. Minutes felt like hours. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and at the edge of my vision, shapes moved just out of focus. I tried to run, but my legs refused the sudden speed, clumsy and heavy in the undergrowth. Every step brought new anxiety, the forest twisting just enough to disorient me, to make each familiar sound seem alien. My mind circled back to the footprints. Where had they gone? Were they leading me somewhere? Or was I just following some trick of my imagination? Finally, after what felt like a relentless trek through a living labyrinth, the dense woods thinned. The familiar clearing near the ranger station came into view. Relief should have washed over me, but it didn't. The clearing was empty. No cars, no people. Nothing to indicate that the world beyond this forest existed. Only the muted wind through the pines and my ragged breaths. My hands shook as I checked my pack, my mind replaying every sound, every movement, every whisper. Something had been there, something unseen, watching, guiding, or mocking. And it wasn't gone, not really. The quiet dread lingered in the spaces between my thoughts, gnawing like a living thing. I didn't stay long. I retraced the trail to my car, the familiar signs of civilization a distant promise. Even as I drove away, the forest seemed to cling to me, the memory of whispers and cold presence etched into my muscles, my nerves taut long after I left. I've returned since, but never alone. Each hike is a careful orchestration of safety, of companions and daylight. And yet, I know the memory of those whispers is permanent, an uninvited passenger that sits in the back of my mind, waiting. The Blue Ridge Trail, once a sanctuary, had revealed a secret layer I couldn't unsee, a quiet, deliberate awareness in the woods, something human in its patience, but entirely alien in its purpose. Even now, I hear that soft, teasing rhythm in the wind at night, and I remember the pressing weight at my neck, the footprints that vanished before I could reach them, and I understand that solitude in the mountains can sometimes be the most dangerous place of all. The forest doesn't forgive curiosity. It watches, it waits, and sometimes it lets you go, but never unchanged. I set out on Devil's Backbone Ridge in early autumn, the kind of day that made solo hiking feel almost sacred. The air crisp, leaves crunching underfoot, the distant caw of a crow breaking the silence. The ridge itself was quiet, stripped of the weekend crowds I sometimes encountered, and the solitude was soothing at first. I liked it that way. The sound of my boots against the dirt trail, the occasional snapping twig, the wind brushing through the treetops. Each step felt rhythmic, grounding, until I noticed them. Shadows moving just beyond the edge of the tree lane. At first, I dismissed them as deer or squirrels, a trick of light and motion through the branches. But something was off. They didn't move like animals. Their shapes were too deliberate, too upright, too human in their contours. I paused and studied them. That's when I realized they mirrored my movements. Not exactly, but close enough to make my stomach tighten. If I raised my arm, one shadow raised an arm, lagging just a moment behind. If I stopped, the movement halted, though never perfectly in sync. There was a delay, a hesitation, an unnatural quality that made my skin crawl. I told myself the fading light was playing tricks, that shadows always stretch and distort as the sun sinks lower. But the feeling of being watched wasn't something the mind invents easily. It pressed on me, quiet, persistent, and heavy. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragged across bark. It followed me along the ridge. I froze, listening, heart hammering in my chest. The sound paused when I stopped moving, resumed when I walked. My imagination tried to rationalize it. Branches scraping against rocks, maybe a loose piece of bark falling, but I knew it wasn't natural. The ridge narrowed as the trail climbed, steep drops to either side, the kind of terrain where a slip could be fatal. Every step I took, the scraping persisted, accompanied by the subtle, deliberate shadows at the edge of my vision. Panic started to creep in. My pace quickened, though not too much. I had to keep my footing. My eyes darted constantly to the tree lane, catching those shapes flickering just beyond the trees. They weren't consistent, vanishing at times, then appearing again further along the trail, always following, always watching. My breath hitched, and my legs felt heavy, weighed down by adrenaline and fear. I tried speaking aloud, muttering that I was alone, that there was nothing there, but the words felt empty, swallowed by the thick autumn air. The ridge twisted and bent in ways that seemed unfamiliar, though I'd hiked this trail before. Every rock, every tree, seemed subtly different, just enough to make my mind question reality. The sky darkened faster than expected. Shadows stretched unnaturally, elongating with the dying light. The wind rose slightly, carrying a low, almost whispering sound, but no words. I had the sense that whatever followed me knew my fear, feeding on it silently. The ridge offered no hiding spots. The trees were thin in some sections, dense in others. I found myself weaving along the trail, sometimes veering closer to the drops to keep the shadows at bay, or at least to make myself feel safer. The effect was illusory. The shapes adapted, lingering where I didn't expect them. I could never get a full view, never a clear sense of what they were, only the creeping awareness that they were deliberate, patient, and persistent. At one point, I stumbled on a root, my boots skidding on damp leaves, and I caught myself just in time. That instant of vulnerability made the shadows feel closer, almost tasting my fear. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion, nerves, imagination. But the scraping sound continued, rhythmic, pressing, and the shadows returned as I stood up. They didn't move closer, not overtly, but I felt their gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. My chest tightened, and I fought the urge to run, knowing the terrain would betray me if I did. The campsite at the end of the trail came into view just as twilight deepened. Relief should have come with it, but I felt none. I slowed, approaching cautiously. The small clearing was empty. No other hikers, no signs of human presence. Only the whispering wind and the fading shadows clinging to the edges of the trees. My legs shook, my hands were slick with sweat, and the silence pressed down like a physical weight. I sat on a fallen log, trying to calm myself, to rationalize what I'd seen. The shadows were gone, or had they ever truly been there? The memory of their movements, deliberate, patient, mirrors of my own, replayed in my mind relentlessly. I eventually made my way back down the trail, moving slowly, deliberately, checking every corner, every bend, expecting them to appear again. The forest seemed different on the return journey. The shapes of trees subtly shifted, the wind carrying soft, mournful sounds that weren't there before. I kept speaking aloud, grounding myself in the tangible, the real, dirt under my boots, branches in my hands, my own ragged breath. But even as I approached the trailhead, the sensation of being watched didn't fade. My eyes kept flicking to the edges of the trees, half expecting to see those patient, mirrored shapes. That night, in my small cabin near the ridge, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside, branches scraping, the wind rustling, set my heart racing. I imagined the shadows standing silently just beyond the tree-line, waiting for another chance to follow. I thought about the ridge, the narrow paths, the steep drops, and the way the shadows had adapted to my movements. I realized I had been lucky, that the forest had let me leave, but only as a reminder. Since then, I haven't hiked Devil's Backbone Ridge alone. I bring companions now, even when the trail seems empty. The memory of those shadows, patient and deliberate, lingers. It clings to the edges of my vision, haunts the quiet moments, and reminds me that the mountains have their own watchful presence. That ridge is beautiful, serene in daylight, but the calm is deceptive. I know from experience that solitude in those woods is never truly solitary. Something is always there, observing, patient, and I can still feel it, even now, waiting for the moment when my guard is down. The experience left a mark that can't be erased. The shadows were real in the sense that their effect on me was undeniable. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker at the edge of vision carries a weight I can't explain. Even on trails I know well, I sometimes hesitate, recalling how careful, deliberate, and patient those shapes had been. There's a rhythm to them, a deliberate pattern that doesn't belong to the forest, to the animals, or even to the wind. And though I returned safely that day, the lingering dread persists. It's the kind of fear that isn't satisfied by explanation or logic. It waits patiently in the corners of memory, a reminder that the mountains, and perhaps something beyond them, are always watching. I set out on Lost Mountain with the kind of confidence only repeated solo hikes can breed. The day had started bright, sunlight spilling over the peaks and glinting off the autumn leaves in a kaleidoscope of gold and amber. The trail was marked by cairns, small stacks of stones, each carefully balanced atop the other, a guide for hikers like me. I had followed them without thought at first, appreciating their quiet guidance, the way they punctuated the trail with silent markers. But as I climbed higher, something began to unsettle me. One cairn I had passed 30 minutes earlier seemed different, or perhaps missing. I stopped and looked back, scanning the path I had just traveled. It wasn't just one. Several of the cairns I had relied upon were gone, their neat piles replaced by others in patterns I didn't recognize. My heart thumped as I hesitated, unsure whether to push forward or retrace my steps. Anxiety tightened around my chest, a physical weight that made each breath feel shallow. I attempted to backtrack, hoping the path behind me would be familiar, a reassurance that I was merely misremembering. But the trail seemed to shift subtly under my gaze. Stones that had once marked a straight passage were gone. Tree roots, rocks, even the way the light fell across the slope, nothing matched what I remembered. The mountain felt alive, bending, reshaping itself around me, each twist and contour tuned to some rhythm I couldn't understand. The shadows of trees stretched in ways that didn't make sense, leaning where sunlight should have struck, and the wind carried low, mournful sighs that seemed almost sentient. At one point, I thought I heard someone call my name, faint and distant, as if drifting up from the valley far below. I froze, listening, scanning the surrounding woods, but the echo was alone in its call. No one emerged from the trees, no figure revealed itself, yet the sound remained vivid in my mind. My pulse raced, but I told myself it was just the wind, the mountain playing tricks on me. Still, the feeling of being observed pulsed through my veins, relentless and pressing. Every time I paused, studying the trail ahead, I noticed the cairns shifting again. They weren't random, they seemed deliberate, appearing further along, guiding me deeper into the mountain. My rational mind fought to explain it. Perhaps hikers had come before me, adjusting the stones, but the rhythm, the predictability of their movement in response to me, made that impossible to accept. My sense of time began to blur. I lost track of how long I had been hiking, whether minutes or hours had passed. The mountain's pulse seemed to synchronize with my own heartbeat, a quiet, omnipresent awareness of my intrusion. As the sun fell lower, the forest around me deepened in shadow. The trail narrowed, bordered by dense underbrush and jagged rock faces, and the mountain seemed to close in. I moved cautiously, my eyes darting between the shifting cairns and the undergrowth. The wind's sighs became intermittent, almost like whispers just beyond comprehension. I imagined faces in the shadows, imagined figures watching silently, but I forced myself to focus on the path. My hands grazed over the cairns as I passed, careful not to disturb them, though I knew it would have done nothing to alter their strange arrangement. At one point, I lost the trail entirely. The cairns ahead were there, yet the slope beneath them was unfamiliar. I had no sense of direction. Every attempt to orient myself seemed thwarted by some subtle trick of the terrain. The forest felt alive, each rustle of leaves or crack of a branch amplified in the eerie silence. I began speaking aloud, repeating my own name, calling out that I was alone, that I meant no harm, yet the words echoed back at me from strange angles, distorted and hollow. My voice felt tiny against the mountain's weight, swallowed almost immediately by the surrounding trees. Hours, or was it only moments, passed before I stumbled onto a clearing I recognized. Relief should have washed over me, but it didn't. The cairns that had guided me there still stood, perfectly balanced, yet their pattern made no sense in the familiar space. I pressed on, but every turn and ridge seemed slightly altered, as if the mountain itself had reshaped while I wasn't looking. My feet dragged through fallen leaves, my breath fogging in the cold evening air. The faint call of my name lingered somewhere beneath me, somewhere I could not reach, and I understood then that Lost Mountain had marked me, a quiet witness to my solitary journey. By sunset, I reached a junction I knew well, a path I had taken many times before with confidence. The landscape seemed ordinary again, familiar and forgiving, but the memory of the vanishing stones, the shifting trail, and that distant voice clung to me. I could feel the mountain's presence still, patient and aware, as if it had observed every step, every hesitation, every shiver of fear. I left Lost Mountain that day exhausted, but not just from the hike. I carried with me a weight of unease that followed for hours, then days, and in quiet moments, weeks later. I haven't hiked Lost Mountain alone since. Even in the daylight, the thought of cairns vanishing and reappearing, the trail bending subtly beyond recognition, and the distant haunting call of my name, fills me with dread. The mountain is patient, deliberate, and in its quietness, deeply observant. It teaches a lesson in humility and fear. Solitude on its slopes is never truly solitary, and the path can always shift beneath your feet, guided by some presence just beyond perception. Every time I remember the hike, the echo of that call and the strange, deliberate arrangement of stones pulses through my mind, a lingering reminder that some places in the Appalachians are alive in ways we can't understand, watching in silence, waiting. I entered Hemlock Hollow late one summer afternoon, hoping for a quiet hike, the kind that leaves your mind light and your chest full of crisp mountain air. The forest at first seemed ordinary, welcoming even, the sun spilling golden light through the leaves and the soft, warm scent of damp earth filling my lungs. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, lined with ferns and moss, and the occasional rock protruded just enough to test careful footing. I loved these walks, the solitude, the sounds of my own boots against the dirt, the distant calls of birds. But the moment I stepped deeper into the hollow, into that denser part of the forest where sunlight barely touched the ground, I sensed something different. The first sign was subtle. The sounds I made, crunching leaves beneath my feet, snapping twigs, didn't behave as they normally did. Each step I took echoed back to me, slower than reality, distorted, almost mocking. I paused and held my breath, thinking perhaps it was the angle of the hollow, the shape of the land carrying sound strangely. But even when I stood still, the echoes continued. A single snap of a branch resonated long after the sound should have faded, stretching unnaturally through the dense undergrowth. My chest tightened, a cold prickle crawling up my spine, and I forced myself to continue. The deeper I walked, the more the hollow seemed alive in ways I couldn't explain. Shadows stretched across the forest floor at angles that didn't match the fading sunlight. Trees leaned subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if nudging me down the winding trail. I told myself I was imagining it, that the heat of the day and the fatigue of the climb were distorting my senses. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted, low and persistent, threading through the air like a whisper I couldn't hear clearly. And then I did, the faintest, almost hesitant voice. "Don't leave." My heart jumped violently in my chest. I spun around, eyes scanning the dense underbrush, the trees, the shaded pockets of the hollow. Nothing. Not a single person, not a rustle, not a shadow that could explain the voice. My pulse thundered, my legs tense, but I pressed forward, hoping the sound was a trick of the wind, a half-formed illusion. But with each step, the whispers, or perhaps my own mind projecting them, seemed to cling closer, and the distorted echoes of my movements persisted, a taunting rhythm that followed me like an unseen companion. The path twisted unpredictably. Sections of the trail that I remembered as gradual inclines became steep in places they shouldn't, and I stumbled over roots and rocks that seemed to have appeared overnight. The hollow closed in around me, the trees pressing tighter, their branches almost like arms reaching out. I tried to backtrack, hoping to escape the growing dread, but every route seemed to lead in circles, each turn uncanny in its familiarity yet subtly wrong. The hollow's pulse felt alive beneath my feet, each step in tune with a rhythm I could not understand. The light waned, filtered through the dense canopy in weak slanted beams, making the forest floor look warped and uneven. Shadows grew unnaturally long, sometimes resembling figures standing just out of reach. I strained to see, to reassure myself that I was alone, but the shapes shifted and melted into the darkening woods. I called out, my voice trembling, half expecting an answer, half praying for silence. Only my own words echoed back, warped and drawn out, laughterless and strange, like the forest itself had learned to mock me. By the time night fully descended, a thick darkness enveloped the hollow. The trees became towering silhouettes, their forms jagged and oppressive. The whisper came again, closer this time, more insistent. "Don't leave." It was low, almost human, a sound that carried intent. I couldn't run, couldn't backtrack. The path had vanished into a labyrinth of shadows and strange, unfamiliar contours. My legs moved on instinct, following some hidden sense that eventually led me to a small creek. The water, glinting faintly in the moonlight, guided me out of the hollow, and with each step I felt the forest's gaze retreat, though not entirely. When I emerged onto a wider trail, familiar territory finally reappeared. Relief should have filled me, but it didn't. The memory of Hemlock Hollow's distorted echoes lingered, and the whisper, so soft yet undeniably there, haunted the spaces between my thoughts. Even in the comfort of my cabin later that night, I could hear faint echoes in my mind, each sound of leaves, twigs, or distant water carrying that same mocking quality. I realized then that the hollow was patient and deliberate, that it had observed my every movement, and that it had no need to follow me. Its impression was permanent. I haven't returned to Hemlock Hollow alone. Even the daylight trail, with its familiar markers and steady incline, carries the weight of what I experienced. Every shadowed hollow, every whisper of wind, every distorted echo now reminds me of that late summer afternoon. The forest felt alive, aware, and indifferent to my presence, and I understand now that some places in the Appalachians hold themselves in ways we cannot predict or escape. Hemlock Hollow waits quietly for the next hiker, patient and unwavering, its whispers never quite fading, even in memory. The trail along Bear Creek had always felt like a refuge to me, a narrow path winding through dense forest, with the water glinting under the moonlight like liquid silver. I had been hiking for hours, the quiet of the woods settling over me like a soft blanket, and I welcomed it. Each step on the uneven dirt path was accompanied by the gentle babble of the creek beside me, the faint rustle of leaves, and the distant calls of nocturnal birds. The solitude was comforting, a balm after weeks of constant noise and human presence. But that night, the comfort began to unravel, slowly, subtly, as if the forest itself had shifted just enough to make me aware of something I had never noticed before. I first saw them at the edge of the tree line, tall, motionless figures standing just beyond the reach of the moonlight. At first, I convinced myself they were merely shadows, the trick of light and dark on the uneven forest floor. But the shapes were too distinct, too deliberate. I stopped in my tracks, heart skipping a beat, and watched. Every movement I made, lifting my hand, adjusting my pack, was mirrored by those figures, though not perfectly. They lagged behind, hesitant, but precise in mimicry. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and they did not advance or retreat. It was as if they existed solely to observe, patient and unblinking, their intentions unknowable. Panic began to settle in, a slow, creeping weight that made my limbs stiff. I forced myself to take a careful step forward, reasoning that if I moved past them, they might disperse like shadows do in the forest. But with every step, another figure appeared. Each one was taller than the last, or perhaps closer, it was hard to tell in the dim moonlight. The creek beside me, once soothing, now became deafening in my mind. Its gentle babble seemed amplified, echoing in a way that made the forest feel oppressive, alive with something watching just beyond my vision. I tried to speak to break the silence, but my voice sounded fragile against the stillness. No response came, only the eerie consistency of their mirrored movements. I realized that I could not turn my back on them. Even the slightest motion to glance over my shoulder confirmed their presence, perfectly attentive. My stomach twisted, a combination of fear and disbelief, and I struggled to convince myself this was some trick of exhaustion or imagination. Yet every rational thought faltered under the weight of the uncanny. The trail narrowed, the underbrush thickening on either side, and I could no longer step freely without brushing against branches and ferns. The figures remained, unyielding, never encroaching, yet always there. With each careful advance, I noticed subtle details. Their forms were entirely black in the shadows, indistinct, lacking features, yet undeniably human in shape. My mind tried to categorize them, to rationalize, but no explanation sufficed. They were more than shadows, less than beings I could name, and the knowledge of their patient, deliberate observation gnawed at my resolve. Fear forced me forward. I focused on the trail, on the rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the slight unevenness of roots and stones. But the forest seemed to respond to my motion. Every step brought another figure into view, each one positioned to maintain its watchful stance. The creek's babble, constant yet irregular, became a kind of percussion to their presence, and my heartbeat, loud and erratic, seemed to echo through the night as if amplified for their observation. I pressed on, unwilling to stop, terrified that even hesitation would invite consequences I could not foresee. At one point, the trail bent sharply along a steep embankment above the creek. The moonlight glinted off the water, illuminating the edge of the path, and in that brief clarity, I saw more figures standing farther along the opposite bank. My pulse leapt into my throat. They were perfectly still, facing me, yet somehow aware, as though my gaze alone was insufficient to meet their attention. I swallowed hard, the sound of my own breath sounding alien in the night, and forced my feet to move. Each step brought relief tinged with terror. The trailhead was closer, yet the figures remained, unyielding and patient, etched into my memory like burned charcoal on a pale wall. The further I walked, the heavier the air seemed. Mist began to rise from the creek, curling around my ankles, clinging to my legs. The forest grew denser, the shadows deeper, but the figures never wavered, never blinked, never signaled intent. I tried to make sense of their purpose, to give it shape, but my mind recoiled at the uncertainty. I dared not run, not fully, for the trail was narrow, and one misstep could send me into the creek below. And so I moved cautiously forward and steady, feeling the unseen gaze of countless presences at the edges of my perception. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed in a rhythm that no human could measure. My body ached from tension, muscles stiff and trembling. The figures multiplied, emerging where the forest had once seemed empty. Each motion I made was mirrored in a slow, deliberate echo that heightened my anxiety to a near unbearable pitch. I stumbled on roots and rocks, my hands brushing against the rough bark of trees, grounding myself in reality. But the forest refused to yield. The creek's babble seemed to synchronize with my heart, each beat drawing my attention to the unwavering silhouettes beyond the tree lane. Finally, the trailhead emerged, illuminated by the weak glow of moonlight spilling from the clearing beyond. Relief should have washed over me, but it did not. The figures remained, standing along the edges, their forms stark against the pale light. I blinked, shook my head, and moved into the clearing, but even then their presence lingered. Exhaustion overtook me, both physical and mental, as I stumbled toward my car. The night's cold crept through my clothes, but the unease within me burned hotter than any chill. Even now, weeks later, I can recall their patient, deliberate observation. Every shadow in the periphery, every slight shift of leaves, every ripple of moonlight across water conjures the memory of those forms. I have returned to Bear Creek, but never alone. I bring companions, even in daylight, though their presence provides little comfort. The memory is etched too deep, a permanent reminder that some spaces in the Appalachians are alive in ways we cannot measure or name. The trail along Bear Creek may appear serene, the water glinting and the path inviting, but the figures remain in memory, a lingering echo of a night when the forest itself seemed intent on watching. The sense of being observed, patient and silent, never fully leaves. In quiet moments, I hear the soft babble of water and imagine figures standing at the tree lane, waiting for the next wanderer, deliberate and unhurried. The memory has become a shadow of its own, a constant companion, a reminder that the forest can watch without touch, and its patience is as enduring as the mountains themselves. The night along Bear Creek was not one of malice or attack. It was something older, something inscrutable, leaving me shaken, aware, and never quite alone, even in the sunlit days that followed. I had been hiking alone for hours that evening, the kind of trek that usually left me with nothing but the quiet satisfaction of solitude and the fading warmth of the sun on my shoulders. Raven Bridge had always held a certain reputation, an old narrow span over a small gorge, flanked by steep ridges and dense forest. Locals whispered about it in the kind of half-joking, half-serious way that made you uneasy without reason. I'd never felt the stories applied to me before, but as I approached the bridge at dusk, a chill crawled along my spine. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds sang, no rustling of leaves in the wind, not even the distant hum of insects. The usual evening chorus of life had vanished, leaving only a dense, almost tangible silence. The bridge itself appeared longer than I remembered. I slowed my steps, noting the way the planks stretched into shadows, the handrails darker than expected. The gorge below seemed to deepen unnaturally, black water curling along rocks I hadn't noticed on previous visits. My feet made soft, hollow thuds on the worn wood, each step echoing far too clearly in the oppressive stillness. I tried to convince myself it was merely an illusion caused by the fading light, but instinct gnawed at me, a low, insistent warning that something wasn't right. Midway across the span, the air shifted. A weight cold and icy pressed down onto my shoulders as though an unseen hand had settled there. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming. The pressure was brief but undeniable, heavy enough to make me stagger slightly, yet when I spun around, there was no one. Nothing moved on the bridge or in the surrounding forest. The wind didn't even whisper. And then it came, a faint, deliberate whisper that cut through the silence with unnatural clarity. Turn back. I couldn't tell if it had come from above, below, or directly into my ear. My instinct screamed to obey, to retreat immediately, but something, a mix of stubbornness and morbid curiosity, pushed me forward. I focused on the planks beneath my boots, the rhythmic sound anchoring me to the tangible, refusing to let my mind spiral into panic. Every step felt deliberate, measured, and painfully slow, as if the bridge itself resisted my passage. The shadows seemed to cling tighter to the edges, the gorge beneath widening just enough to make my stomach lurch with each glance. Halfway across, I could feel the tension building, not just in my body but in the forest around me. The stillness was no longer empty. It felt alive. Every tree, every shadow, seemed to hold a gaze that tracked me relentlessly. The railing under my hands felt colder than the air around it, almost damp with something I couldn't name. My mind fought to rationalize it, an overactive imagination, nerves frayed from hours of hiking, or perhaps a trick of the evening light. But the instinctive fear persisted, deep and unyielding, crawling under my skin and lodging in my chest. The whisper returned, this time closer, though I could still sense no source. Turn back. Each syllable was deliberate, patient, almost bored in its repetition, as if the forest had grown tired of my presence. My heart pounded violently, my breath shallow and uneven. I told myself that I was alone, that no one else could be here, and yet the sensation of eyes pressing on me from all directions refused to vanish. I dared not look down at the gorge, afraid that doing so would invite something impossible to escape. I forced myself to continue, one slow, deliberate step at a time. Each footfall felt like crossing a threshold into something older than the trail, older than the bridge itself. The planks beneath me groaned softly, unnaturally, or perhaps it was the echo of my own imagination. The shadows shifted slightly at the corners of my vision, and though I kept my gaze fixed forward, I could feel the brush of awareness brushing against the edges of my consciousness. By the time I reached the far side, the oppressive pressure lifted suddenly, leaving only the crisp evening air against my skin. I looked back over the bridge, expecting to see it stretch endlessly again, the darkness pooling beneath it. But the span appeared normal as it always had, its length and width familiar, its planks ordinary in the fading light. The stillness was gone. The forest had returned to itself, though my own heartbeat remained jagged and tense. Even as I walked away, following the trail that led deeper into the woods, I could not shake the feeling of eyes lingering on me, persistent and unyielding. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, carried the weight of unseen observation. The forest seemed ordinary, yet in the shadowed spaces between trees, I knew something had been present, patient and deliberate, marking my passage and letting me go only when it saw fit. I have returned to that trail since, but never alone, and never at dusk. Even in daylight, when the bridge is nothing more than an ordinary crossing over a small gorge, I remember the weight on my shoulders, the patient whisper, and the oppressive stillness that stretched across Raven Bridge that evening. The forest keeps its secrets patiently, and some encounters leave marks deeper than any physical wound. That night, the bridge became more than a span of wood. It became a threshold, a reminder that solitude in the Appalachian wilderness can be a fragile illusion, and some presences, though unseen, linger long after you have stepped into safety. The memory of the whisper, patient and deliberate, remains. In quiet moments, I hear it again in my mind, a low warning against curiosity, against venturing alone. Raven Bridge is ordinary enough under sunlight, but the experience endures, haunting the edges of my perception. Even miles away from the trail, I can feel the unseen eyes, patient and unblinking, following, measuring, waiting. The bridge, the gorge, the forest itself, they have claimed a small piece of my memory, leaving me wary, alert, and profoundly aware that not all crossings are meant to be taken without consequence. I started my hike up Owl's Nest Ridge just after sunset, the kind of late summer evening where the air still carried warmth but the shadows were already deepening, swallowing the forest floor in a slow creeping gloom. The trail was narrow and winding, flanked by dense pines and the occasional jagged rock outcropping, the kind of terrain where one misstep could send a person tumbling into darkness. At first, the hike felt peaceful, the quiet punctuated by the distant calls of birds settling in for the night, and the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle wind. I liked these solitary hikes, the way the ridge stretched before me like a place untouched, where time moved differently, and the outside world felt impossibly far away. As I ascended, a flicker of light caught my eye in the distance. It was subtle at first, a brief glimmer through the trees, like a lantern swaying with the wind. I paused, blinking against the fading light, trying to convince myself it was just a reflection off a rock or a trick of my imagination. But when I took another step, it appeared again, swaying gently as if caught in some silent rhythm. My mixture of curiosity and unease. I moved closer, each careful step on the uneven trail punctuated by the soft snap of twigs and the scrape of my boots against stones. Yet when I drew within what should have been range to see the source, the light vanished entirely, leaving only dense, black shadows clinging to the trunks of the trees. I pressed on, trying to rationalize it, telling myself I was tired or imagining things after hours of hiking alone. But the path began to twist in ways that felt unnatural, bending and turning at angles I hadn't noticed before. Sections of the trail that I remembered as gradual slopes became unexpectedly steep, jagged roots and fallen branches appearing where none had been moments earlier. The forest seemed to shift subtly with every step, and the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the high branches, but the sound was too deliberate, too patterned, drifting from above in voices that carried syllables without words, like murmurs attempting language but failing. I froze, listening, straining to make sense of them, but the hollowing effect of the whispers made my own breath sound loud and intrusive. Every movement felt laborious, as if the forest itself resisted my passage. The weight of the trees, the darkness gathering between trunks, the twisting of the trail. Everything seemed to press against me. My hands grazed the rough bark of pines to steady myself, and each step became a conscious effort to maintain forward motion. I forced myself to keep walking, telling myself that persistence would bring clarity, that eventually the path would straighten, the lights would fade, and the ridge would return to normal. But the deeper I went, the more the air seemed alive with observation. The flickers of light returned intermittently, brief and teasing, appearing at angles that suggested movement but never revealing a source. I noticed shadows clinging unnaturally to the trees, extending far longer than moonlight should allow, stretching and bending in ways that did not match the slope of the land. My skin prickled with tension, every hair on my arms standing as though responding to an invisible presence. Occasionally, a flicker of light would return, brief and tantalizing, as though acknowledging me, warning me, or simply watching. Each glimpse left my stomach twisting, a mixture of dread and fascination that made me hesitant to turn away. I felt like a trespasser in a space that had its own rules, a place older and more deliberate than I could comprehend. The trail grew steeper, the underbrush tighter, and I stumbled over roots and loose stones, my boots scraping against the soil as my muscles screamed from fatigue. The whispers persisted, drifting down from above, sometimes soft, almost like breathing, sometimes sharp enough to startle me. The forest had become an active participant in my journey, the ridge itself resisting, testing me, making each step feel heavier. My heart raced, and I had to stop several times to steady myself, to shake off the growing sense that I was being measured, observed, studied by something patient and unseen. Hours, or it could have been minutes. Time felt meaningless in that hollowed, shadowed space, passed before I finally emerged from the densest section of the ridge. The flickering lights returned briefly, a final acknowledgement, dancing for just a heartbeat before disappearing behind the trees. The trail opened to a familiar clearing, moonlight spilling across the ground, ordinary and forgiving once again. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. The memory of the ridge, the shifting trail, the unnatural twists, the whispers, and those teasing, ghostly lights, remained burned into my mind. Even now, every hike I take recalls the flickering glow of Owl's Nest Ridge. In twilight or dim moonlight, when shadows lengthen and the wind carries low murmurs through the trees, I feel the weight of that ridge pressing quietly against my senses. The lights, though gone, remain etched in memory, as though part of the forest itself had chosen to leave a warning, or perhaps a witness. I have returned to that ridge, but never alone, and never without caution, because the memory of those flickering, ghostly lights is a reminder that some places in Appalachia hold a presence, patient and deliberate, and that the forest can observe in ways far beyond human comprehension. The flickers and whispers, the heavy steps, the twisting, shifting path, they haunt me still. Even miles away from Owl's Nest Ridge, I can feel the subtle, lingering tension of that night, the ridge itself echoing my fear. It is a quiet dread, slow and persistent, and the memory refuses to fade. The lights may have vanished, but their presence lingers in shadowed corners, in the spaces between trees, and in the deep, patient pulse of the forest, reminding me that the ridge is older, wiser, and infinitely more deliberate than any hiker who dares to traverse it. I had been hiking Whistler Trail for hours that day, the late spring sun dropping low in the sky, casting long, uneven shadows across the narrow path. I'd taken this route countless times, but that afternoon something compelled me to stray from the main trail, drawn by the quiet and the scent of wet earth and moss that always seemed more vibrant off the beaten path. The forest was thick here, the canopy so dense that even late afternoon sunlight barely pierced the green, leaving the trail dim and intimate, filled with the soft sounds of leaves brushing against one another and distant birds calling to each other. I welcomed the solitude, eager for the kind of isolation that lets the mind wander, and sometimes too easily overthink. It was then that I stumbled upon the clearing. At first, I thought it was merely a widening of the trail, a natural glade that had escaped my notice in previous hikes. But as I stepped further into the space, the air changed abruptly. A coldness clung to me, seeping through my clothes, different from the usual cool shade of the forest. It was almost viscous, pressing against my skin and breathing, a kind of subtle resistance in the very air. The clearing was small, hemmed in on all sides by thick trunks and undergrowth, and the sunlight that filtered through was weak, pale, and inconsistent. The ground was soft beneath my boots, a mixture of moss and fallen leaves, but something about it felt deliberate. As I explored, I began to notice signs that the clearing had been visited before, though no footprints marred the earth. Stones were arranged in small, careful circles, some forming crude patterns that suggested ritual or deliberate order. Small patches of charred earth indicated fires had burned here, though the wood had long since rotted away. Everything seemed carefully placed, as if whoever, or whatever, had been here wanted it to remain undisturbed. I crouched to examine a circle of stones, my fingers brushing over the rough surfaces, and felt an odd unease, like I was trespassing into something private and long forgotten. The forest fell unnaturally quiet. The usual creak of the wind through branches and rustle of distant creatures had vanished, replaced by a heavy stillness that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I turned sharply at a sudden rustling sound, leaves brushing against each other, the snap of a twig, but no one was there. The clearing was empty, yet I felt eyes on me, patient and invisible, lingering just beyond the edges of perception. My heart began to hammer in my chest, each beat echoing too loudly in the silence, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, reminding myself that the forest was full of life, even if hidden. As I wandered further into the clearing, something even stranger began to occur. The edges of the space seemed to shift when I looked away, subtle adjustments that made the geometry of the clearing feel impossible. A cluster of stones I had examined moments earlier now appeared slightly farther away, the angles between trees subtly altered, the slope of the ground just enough to feel wrong. I spun, trying to find a reference point, but each turn revealed new, disorienting perspectives. It was as though the clearing had a mind of its own, a shape not fixed, responding to my presence in a way that was patient, deliberate, and unsettling. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed as I explored and attempted to make sense of it. My footsteps became cautious, each movement measured, aware that the space could shift again if I wasn't attentive. Occasionally, I would catch a glimpse of movement at the edges of my vision, a fleeting shadow that disappeared as soon as I tried to focus on it. The forest beyond the clearing remained impossibly still, yet I sensed a presence, something watching from the thicket, unhurried, patient. The sun dropped lower, casting longer shadows that stretched unnaturally across the clearing, amplifying the sense that the space was alive, aware of me. Eventually, I realized I had to leave. I backtracked to the narrow path I had diverted from, each step heavy with reluctance, each glance over my shoulder confirming that the clearing was not entirely empty. When I finally emerged back onto the familiar main trail, the forest seemed normal again, the sounds of birds, insects, and rustling leaves returning in a comforting chorus. Yet the geometry of the clearing lingered in my mind, impossible and unyielding, an unspoken warning that some places in the Appalachian wilderness are not meant to be entered lightly, and never alone. Even weeks later, the memory haunts me. I dream of the clearing's subtle shifts, the careful arrangement of stones, the coldness that clung to the air, and the faint rustle that seemed to follow me no matter where I turned. It is a quiet dread, persistent and patient, a reminder that the forest carries its own consciousness, and some spaces are alive in ways we cannot understand. I have returned to Whistler Trail many times since, but I never stray from the main path, and I never visit the clearing again. The memory remains, a shadow of the forest that lingers at the edges of thought, patient and unyielding, a warning that solitude in the wilderness can sometimes invite observation from spaces unseen, and that some clearings should remain hidden forever. The clearing's presence is subtle, almost a whisper, yet unmistakable in memory. In quiet moments, I can feel it pressing at the edges of my mind. The cold air, the shifting geometry, the careful stones. The forest remembers. The clearing remembers. And I have learned that some encounters, though brief, leave a mark far longer than any physical scar. Whistler Trail may seem ordinary now, sunlit and inviting, but the hidden clearing waits in patient silence, and its memory lingers like a shadow, reminding me that the mountains are never as empty or as safe as they appear. I had always loved hiking the Blue Ridge summit alone, especially in the late summer when the air is crisp but not cold, and the haze softens the edges of distant ridges. It was the kind of trail where you feel removed from the world, wrapped in a quiet that seems older than yourself. That morning, I set out early, the sun low and the forest still damp with dew. The climb was familiar, the roots, the stones, the occasional twisted pine that jutted out over the trail. But something about that day felt subtly off, though I couldn't place it. The birds were quieter than usual, and even the wind seemed restrained, brushing through the leaves with a hesitancy I had never noticed before. By the time I reached the summit, the view was as breathtaking as ever, rolling ridges stretching into soft blue haze, the valley below caught in light and shadow. But the wind had changed. There was a pattern to it, carrying murmurs that were impossible to ignore. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by solitude. But the whispers were precise, intimate, almost like echoes of my own thoughts. A phrase I had only just considered seemed to drift on the breeze, audible yet impossibly far away. My heart thumped, a slow, cautious drum, and I scanned the ridgeline. There was no one there. No other hikers, no animals, just the wind and the trail. Yet the murmurs continued, distant and intimate, threading themselves through my mind. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was fatigue, the brain playing tricks, but the voices persisted, shifting in tone and volume as if attuned to my attention. They did not speak words I could comprehend fully, but there was intent behind them, a rhythm, a cadence that made me feel observed, as though the summit itself were listening and responding. The sky darkened unnaturally fast. One moment it was a clear afternoon. The next, shadows seemed to fold over the distant ridges in a way that made the valley appear smaller, suffocating, and yet more vast at the same time. The light lost its warmth, turning muted, cold. I started down the summit, every step feeling heavier than the last, each footfall accompanied by the persistent murmurs that seemed to guide me along the trail. I tried to focus on familiar landmarks, but the shadows shifted, the trail appearing subtly different with every turn. Rocks that should have been stable now seemed to tilt under my feet. Tree roots twisted in ways I didn't remember. My pace quickened, not out of panic, but because the voices pressed forward, patient and deliberate, coaxing me along. There was a sense of intention in the air, an invisible hand nudging me, reminding me that the mountain had been watching all along. As I descended further, the murmurs grew more insistent. Occasionally, I caught a phrase that mirrored my thoughts exactly. Something I had been worried about, something I had whispered aloud in passing. It was impossible yet undeniable. Every time I paused, the wind would shift, carrying those sounds closer, circling me, threading into the rhythm of my heartbeat. The forest, normally comforting in its quiet, became oppressive, alive with awareness. Shadows deepened unnaturally around me, the shapes of trees bending subtly, almost as if they were leaning in to observe. Hours, or perhaps minutes, for time seemed to stretch and fold unnaturally. The summit loomed behind me, the ridge above appearing distorted, edges sharper and sharper, yet somehow familiar. My mind jittered, every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch, a reminder that the mountains had been listening, that the murmurs were not idle, that the solitude I had cherished could not hide me. The trail seemed longer, each step a negotiation with the weight of the air, the sound of my own boots amplified by an unseen presence. The murmurs would rise when I slowed, pause when I picked up my pace, almost playing a game of patience with me. By the time I reached the base, the valley open and welcoming again, the sky returning to its usual hue, my mind was taut with unease. Every natural sound, the wind in the trees, the distant call of a bird, the babble of a creek, felt loaded as though carrying hidden meaning. I could still hear the faint echo of murmurs beneath the hum of the forest, threaded through my memory, impossible to fully shake. The summit behind me looked ordinary, but the experience left a mark deeper than any physical exhaustion or ache from the hike. I knew the mountains had been listening, patient, deliberate, recording the presence of those who wandered alone. Even now, long after that day, I can recall the sensation with unnerving clarity. The intimate whispers, the unnatural folding of shadows, the guiding insistence of the murmurs, they haunt the edges of my perception. Sometimes, when the wind shifts through the trees near my home, I think I hear them again, subtle and patient, a reminder of the summit, of solitude observed, and of the mountains that can remember. The trail to Blue Ridge Summit remains inviting, but the memory lingers like a shadow across my thoughts, quiet yet persistent, and I will never hike that ridge alone again. The experience was not violent, not sudden, but deeply unsettling, a reminder that some heights are more aware than the human mind can comprehend, and that the Appalachian wilderness is patient in its observation, waiting for those who wander unaccompanied to notice its silent attention. The murmurs of Blue Ridge Summit remain with me, always in the periphery, an echo of a day when solitude was interrupted by something older, slower, and far more deliberate than I could ever name. Even miles away, the ridge's presence presses gently at the edges of memory, a quiet insistence that the mountains remember, that they listen, and that some encounters leave marks deeper than any visible scar, waiting to whisper their truth long after the trail is behind you. I started the hike to Widow's Peak early that morning, the sky a clear blue and the sun warming my shoulders as I tightened the straps on my pack. The trail was familiar, a favorite of mine for years, known for its steep climbs and sweeping views of the valleys below. There was a crispness to the air that day, a promise of solitude and the kind of quiet only found in high ridges, far from roads and towns. The first mile was pleasant, my boots crunching over loose rocks and fallen pine needles, my breath steady, the forest alive with the usual chorus of birds and wind. I felt comfortable, confident, and entirely alone. Then the fog arrived, creeping up the valley and over the ridge faster than I had anticipated. One moment the sun glinted off the leaves. The next, visibility dropped to mere feet. The world shrank around me, and the trail that had seemed so clear became a shifting corridor of whiteness. Every familiar landmark vanished into the gray, and I found myself relying on memory alone to navigate. The fog pressed against my skin, damp and heavy, and carried with it a stillness that was unnatural, as though it had swallowed not just sound, but presence. Even the wind seemed muffled, replaced by the soft, whispering brush of mist on leaves and branches. As I moved forward, shapes emerged from the fog, warped and unsettling. Trees appeared twisted, their branches like reaching arms, shadows stretching impossibly across the trail. Rocks that I recognized seemed taller, sharper, more menacing. Every time I paused, the fog thickened around me, curling closer as if responding to my hesitation. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or lack thereof, but there was an intent to the mist, a deliberate presence that I could feel pressing against the edges of perception. Then I heard it. Footsteps behind me, soft but distinct. I froze, my ears straining. My heart hammered as I slowly turned, but the fog was empty, and the trail behind me showed no sign of anyone passing. I quickened my pace, each step tentative but necessary, yet the footsteps seemed to follow, matching the rhythm of my own, sometimes lagging just enough to make me question if they were real. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Perhaps it was my own movements echoing in the thick mist, the way sound can bend and warp in certain conditions. But the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, refused to fade. The fog seemed almost tangible. When I reached for a branch to steady myself on the steep incline, droplets clung and dripped from my fingers like slow rain. Every pause in movement seemed to make the mist swell, surrounding me more completely. I caught glimpses of shapes, rocks, roots, tree trunks, that shifted when I looked away, subtly moving or rearranging themselves, disorienting me further. The trail became difficult to follow. My sense of direction faltered. My own confidence, normally strong on this route, gave way to unease, and a low tension settled in my chest that I could not shake. Hours, or perhaps it was only moments, passed in this fog-bound limbo. Each step required focus, not just to keep from stumbling but to maintain the fragile sense of orientation. Every sound, footfalls on stone, leaves rustling, distant creaks, was magnified, each carrying an unspoken suggestion that I was being measured, observed. Shadows that should have been familiar warped into strange forms, trees leaning just slightly in ways that made me feel like the forest itself was alive, watching my passage. Eventually, the trail began to level, the incline easing as I neared the summit. Then, almost abruptly, the fog receded. Sunlight spilled through the canopy again, warming my damp clothes, illuminating the trail as though the mist had never been there at all. Rocks, roots, and branches appeared familiar once more, yet the memory of their shifting forms lingered, etched into my mind. The trail had recorded me, silently observing, a patient witness to my solitary passage. I paused at the peak, looking out over the valleys, the ridges bathed in golden green, the world calm and ordinary. But beneath that calm, the impression of the fog remained, thick, deliberate, and impossibly attentive. Even now, when I hike that trail, I cannot forget the fog, its uncanny ability to warp the familiar, to press against me, to follow without revealing itself. The experience left a subtle imprint, a quiet dread that surfaces when a wind shifts or a morning mist rolls in. Widow's Peak, ordinary in sunlight and clear weather, carries a presence that is patient and deliberate, recording the passage of those who traverse it alone. That day, the mist marked me, and the mountains, silent and enduring, remembered. The memory persists, more than just a recollection of fog and trail. It is the sense of observation, the uncanny weight of the forest, the unseen presence that traces your steps and waits patiently. Even miles away, I feel it in quiet moments. A subtle pull at the edges of awareness, a reminder that solitude in the Appalachian wilderness is never complete, and that some encounters leave marks deeper than any visible scar. Widow's Peak remains a favorite hike, but I never go alone, and I am always conscious of the spaces where fog might gather, patient and deliberate, waiting to witness again.